Inside the torture chambers of the Tower of London, for nearly 1,000 years, its cold stone walls have loomed over the River Thames, an unshakable symbol of royal power and a fortress of fear. Tourists today wander its courtyards, marvel at the glittering crown jewels, and pose beside the ravens. Yet behind this pageantry of monarchy lies another story, one written not in gold, but in blood, sweat, and screams. For centuries, the tower was more than a palace or a prison. It was a stage for terror, a place where enemies of the crown, or those merely accused, were stripped of dignity, chained in darkness, and subjected to the cruelest torments human imagination could devise. Here, justice was not always about truth, or often it was about submission. Torture was not just a punishment, it was a weapon, a performance, a theater of power designed to break not only the body, but the very spirit of those who defied or merely displeased the rulers of England. In the shadows of its dungeons and chambers, where no sunlight could reach, stood instruments of pain whose very names still echo with dread. The rack designed to stretch the human body until joints tore apart, the Scavenger's daughter, which crushed the body inward until blood seeped from nose, eyes, and ears, and iron manacles which suspended prisoners for hours or days, dislocating limbs with slow, merciless agony. These devices were not just tools of interrogation, they were symbols of absolute power, reminders that the crown could bend flesh and truth alike, and the victims, they were not always traitors or spies. Sometimes they were political opponents, heretics, or even one's loyal courtiers who had fallen out of favor. Their fate was sealed not in the courtroom, but in the echoing corridors of the tower. Here, confession true or false was worth more than justice. Here, the silence of the condemned was drowned by their own screams. Among the most infamous was Guy Fawkes, the man behind the gunpowder plot of 1605. Dragged into the tower. He was stretched upon the rack until his body crumbled and his will shattered. His signature, once bold, was reduced to a trembling scrawl proof, not of guilt but of torment. Then there was an Askew, a young woman accused of heresy, who endured the rack until she could no longer walk. She was carried to the stake in a chair and burned alive, her body broken, but her defiance unyielding. And yet, for every famous name etched into history, countless others remain forgotten. Unnamed prisoners, locked in the bowels of the tower, their stories lost, but their agony preserved in the stone. Visitors today may walk through the White Tower, the Bloody Tower, or the Salt Tower without hearing them. But the walls remember. Every block of stone carries whispers of men and women who once begged for mercy in vain. This is the hidden legacy of the Tower of London, not just a royal fortress or a ceremonial landmark, but a machine of fear that shaped the destiny of a kingdom. It is a place where monarchy and terror were entwined, where politics, faith, and cruelty collided in darkness. In this video, we will step inside those very torture chambers. We will uncover the mechanics of the rack and the Scavenger's daughter, the horrors of the manacles, and the silent suffocation of dungeon cells. We will revisit the stories of those who endured these torments, whether guilty, innocent, or simply unfortunate enough to stand in the path of power. This is not a tale of justice. It is a tale of control, a reminder that in the medieval world, truth could be manufactured through screams, and obedience could be extracted drop by drop through pain. So prepare yourself. Beyond the glitter of the crown jewels, beyond the smiling yeoman warders, and the flutter of ravens, lies a history soaked in fear. Welcome to the hidden heart of the Tower of London. Welcome. Inside the torture chambers, the rack, breaking bodies, breaking spirits among all the instruments of torture housed within the Tower of London. None is more infamous, more feared than the rack. It was not just a device of pain. It was the embodiment of medieval cruelty, symbol of the crown's absolute power in a stage upon which the human body was unmade before the eyes of God and man alike. At first glance, the rack was deceptively simple. Constructed of sturdy wood, it resembled a bed or a table, fitted with rollers at each end. Victims were stripped and bound flat upon its surface, wrists secured at one end, ankles at the other. Thick ropes stretched their limbs taut, leaving no room for movement. At the turn of an iron wheel, the rollers twisted, pulling arms and legs in opposite directions. With every slow crank, bones strained, joints cracked, tendons snapped. The agony was not instantaneous. It was gradual, deliberate, and absolute. The rack was not designed to kill. It was designed to destroy. Witnesses of the time described the process with horror. First came the stretching, as the victim's body was pulled taut like a bowstring. Then, as the wheel turned further, dislocations began. The shoulders tore from their sockets, the hips wrenched apart, the knees twisted unnaturally. The skin grew pale, slick with sweat. The screams rose to a pitch that echoed through the tower's chambers, and still the wheel turned. Eventually, muscle fibers tore, ligaments ruptured, bones cracked under the strain. The body was pushed beyond its natural limits, and in that moment, the prisoner was utterly broken, physically and spiritually. It was said that even the strongest men begged for mercy after only a few turns of the wheel. The rack was not a quick torment, but a slow theater of suffering, one in which the torturer could gauge precisely how much pain to inflict. It was as much a psychological weapon as a physical one. The victim knew that silence would not save them. Every turn of the rack was a promise that the next moment could be worse than the last. Perhaps the most famous victim of the rack was Guy Fawkes, the man whose name still haunts British history each November on bonfire night. Fawkes was captured in 1605 after the failure of the Gunpowder Plot, its conspiracy to blow up the Houses of Parliament and assassinate King James I, taken to the Tower. He was interrogated by royal officials who demanded the names of his fellow conspirators. Fawkes resisted at first, proud and defiant. But defiance soon crumbled when he was placed upon the rack. Records describe how his body was stretched until his frame gave way. The once bold signature of Guido Fawkes upon his confession was reduced to a faint scrawl, his hand too shattered to hold the quill. His confession was not the product of truth but of unbearable agony, but Guy Fawkes was not alone. The rack had claimed countless others or bells, heretics and prisoners accused of treason. In 1546, an Askew, a young Protestant woman accused of heresy, endured the rack in the Tower. She was stretched so violently that her bones broke and her body collapsed. Unable to walk, she was carried to her execution on a chair and burned alive at the stake. Her story remains one of the most harrowing examples of how the rack was used not merely to punish, but to silence and terrify. The rack was not unique to the Tower of London. Similar devices appeared across Europe. Yet in the Tower, it became a political weapon. It was reserved for crimes against the state, for those accused of conspiring against the monarchy or the church. In this way, the rack became more than a tool of torture. It was an extension of authority. To be placed upon it was to feel the full weight of the crown, crushing both body and soul. What made the rack especially terrifying was its public secrecy. Unlike executions, which were often carried out before crowds, the torments of the rack happened in closed chambers. The public rarely saw the device in use, but they heard the rumors, the screams echoing from the tower, the broken figures carried out afterward, the whispered stories of confessions forced by agony. This veil of mystery amplified the rack's power. People did not need to see it to believe in its horror. The very possibility of its use was enough to instill obedience. The rack also reveals something unsettling about human nature. For the torturer, it was not only about extracting information, there was a ritualistic quality to the act. A grotesque artistry in turning the wheel slowly, in calibrating pain with precision. In this sense, the rack transformed suffering into performance. It blurred the line between justice and cruelty, interrogation and sadism. It forced both victim and witness to confront the darkest depths of human imagination. And yet, for all its brutality, the rack was fragile in one sense. It did not always produce truth. When under extreme pain, a prisoner would say anything to make the torment stop. Lies, false confessions, the names of innocent, anything that might grant a moment's reprieve. The Crown knew this, but it mattered little. A confession, however forced, was often enough. The rack was not about uncovering reality, it was about manufacturing obedience. Even today, centuries later, the image of the rack still lingers in our collective memory. Artists, writers, and historians describe it as the ultimate symbol of medieval cruelty. The dark heart of an age where pain was wielded as both punishment and persuasion. To stand in the Tower of London and imagine the sound of the creaking wood, the cries of the condemned, and the relentless turning of the wheel is to feel the presence of a past that refuses to die. The rack broke more than bones, it broke trust in justice, it broke faith in mercy, and it broke the very idea of human dignity. In its turning wheels, we see the machinery of tyranny, how power can twist truth, how agony can be transformed into obedience, and how fear can echo louder than freedom. Thus, Chapter 1 ends where countless victims did, and the rack itself. Stretched beyond recognition, their bodies shattered, their voices silenced, the rack was more than a device. It was a message carved into flesh. The Crown has no limits, and mercy has no place in the Tower of London. The Scavenger's daughter, crushing the soul if the rack symbolized. Expansion stretching the human body to the breaking point its grim counterpart. The Scavenger's daughter represented contraction. Where the rack pulled bodies apart, the Scavenger's daughter crushed them inward. Together, the two devices formed a grotesque balance of torment, one tearing life open, the other compressing it into silence. The Scavenger's daughter was the invention of Sir Leonard Skevington, the lieutenant of the Tower of London during the reign of Henry VIII. Its name, twisted from Skevington's own, became synonymous with agony. The device itself was deceptively simple, an iron frame shaped like a giant letter A or a bent hoop. The victim was forced to kneel within it, their head pushed down between their knees, their arms and legs bound tightly against their chest. The frame then closed, clamping the body into an unnatural, suffocating position. As the iron pressed down, the body was bent forward until ribs cracked, blood vessels burst, and circulation was cut off. Witnesses claimed that under its pressure, blood would stream from the prisoner's nose, ears, and even eyes, unlike the rack, which dislocated joints with dramatic violence. The Scavenger's daughter inflicted a slow, crushing agony that suffocated the body from within. It was less theatrical, less visible to outsiders, but perhaps more terrifying for those who endured it. Prisoners subjected to the Scavenger's daughter often described a sensation of drowning in their own blood. The lungs compressed, the diaphragm strained, and breathing became a desperate struggle. Every heartbeat felt like an explosion in the skull. Every second stretched into eternity. To be locked in the device for minutes was unbearable. To endure it for hours was unimaginable. Records from the tower describe how the Scavenger's daughter was used on those accused of treason or heresy, often as a preliminary step before execution. The aim was the same as with the rack, confession. But where the rack shouted its cruelty through screams and tearing limbs, the Scavenger's daughter whispered its horror in suffocating silence. Victims were left folded and bleeding, broken not only in body but in spirit. The symbolic power of the Scavenger's daughter lay in its reversal of human form. It forced the body into a position of absolute submission, curled like a child in the womb, yet under the weight of iron and cruelty. In a society where posture and bearing reflected dignity and strength, to be bent double, crushed inward, was to be reduced to something less than human. It was a deliberate stripping of identity, way to turn nobles, rebels, or scholars into nameless, whimpering figures of pain. Unlike the rack, whose terror spread widely through rumor and legend, the scavenger's daughter remained relatively rare. Perhaps it was too brutal, too suffocating, even for the standards of Tudor England. Yet its rarity only deepened its aura of dread. To be threatened with the scavenger's daughter was to face not just death, but humiliation, silence, and disintegration from within. One of its most infamous victims was Thomas Maya, an Irishman accused of plotting rebellion against the crown. After being crushed in the device, he was so debilitated that he carved into the wall of his cell the haunting words, "Thomas Maya, which lieth, here alone, that fain would from hence be gone. By torture strange my truth was tried, yet of my liberty denied." His inscription survives to this day, a testimony not just to his suffering, but to the futility of truth under torture. The scavenger's daughter reveals the darker philosophy of punishment in the tower. It was not merely about extracting information, nor even about punishing enemies. It was about annihilating the human will. If the rack created broken bodies that still lived to confess, the scavenger's daughter created broken souls, beings so crushed inward that they could no longer resist, no longer even imagine resistance. Psychologically, the device mirrored the authority of the monarchy itself. Just as the crown demanded total obedience, the scavenger's daughter demanded absolute submission. The victim was folded, compressed, and silenced, their body forced into alignment with the will of their tormentors. In this sense, the device was not only a tool of torture, but a metaphor for power. The crown folding its subjects into submission, leaving no space for dissent. Today, a replica of the scavenger's daughter can still be seen in the Tower of London's collection, though its presence is often overshadowed by the rack. Tourists may glance at it briefly, puzzled by its odd shape, without realizing the silent torment it once inflicted. Yet to study it closely is to glimpse a different kind of horror, one that does not shout, but suffocates, one that does not stretch life apart, but folds it inward until it collapses. The rack may have been the tower's most infamous device, but the scavenger's daughter was its cruel reflection, a reminder that pain can come not only from expansion, but from compression. It was a machine designed not to kill, but to crush, to bleed, and to humiliate. A machine that turned human dignity into silence, and silence into obedience. In the dim light of the tower's dungeons, the iron frame waits still. Though its victims are long gone, the memory remains. To imagine being locked inside it is to imagine the slow implosion of the self, the body collapsing under the weight of steel and fear. And it leaves us with a chilling truth. Sometimes, the cruelest tortures are not those that tear us apart, but those that crush us into nothingness. Chains, manacles, and silent tortures. Not every torment in the Tower of London required elaborate machinery. Some of the cruelest punishments were the simplest chains, manacles, darkness, and silence. These tools lacked the spectacle of the rack or the scavenger's daughter. But for the prisoners who endured them, they were no less devastating. The iron manacles were among the most notorious. Suspended from the dungeon ceiling, they held the prisoner aloft by the wrists alone, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. The victim's full body weight dragged mercilessly on the shoulders, tearing muscles, dislocating joints, and cutting into flesh. With circulation cut off, the hands swelled grotesquely, turning purple, then black. The pain was unrelenting. But worse still was the slow descent into numbness, a terrifying reminder that the body was being permanently damaged with every passing hour. Unlike the rack, manacles left few visible scars. But the internal damage, the torn ligaments, the shattered joints softened, crippled the victim for life. Some could never raise their arms again. Others left the tower permanently maimed, their bodies twisted like grim testimonies of the crown's cruelty. Chains were used not only to suspend, but to confine. Prisoners were shackled to the walls, forced to remain standing in narrow cells where there was no room to sit or lie down. Hours blurred into days. Exhaustion gnawed at the body until even the thought of sleep was torture. Food and water were scarce, and darkness filled every corner. Some prisoners broke after mere days in such confinement, confessing to anything demanded of them just to end the torment. One of the most haunting tales of this kind of torture is that of an Askew, a Protestant reformer who was interrogated at the Tower in 1546 before being burned at the stake. She was racked until her body collapsed. She was then placed in chains, her broken frame suspended and twisted. By the time of her execution, she could not walk. She was carried to the stake on a chair, her body shattered, but her spirit unyielding. Her story reveals how chains and manacles were not isolated punishments, but part of a grim sequence of torment that ended only in death. For many, however, the worst torture was not physical, but psychological. The Tower's dungeons were designed to erase hope. In the Salt Tower and the Bloody Tower, prisoners were kept in solitary darkness. Their only companions, the sound of dripping water and the scratching of rats. Days passed without voices, without light, without even the reassurance of time itself. Silence became its own kind of torment, one that gnawed at the mind and dissolved sanity. Some prisoners carved words into the stone walls, desperate to leave behind proof of their existence. Inscriptions of prayers, names, and pleas still remain, etched like scars upon the tower's interior. Each carving is a whisper from the past, a reminder that silence could not completely erase them. Yet for many more, there are no words left behind, only emptiness. Psychological torture was as deliberate as the physical. Deprivation of food and warmth, endless interrogations, and the knowledge that execution awaited all served to grind the prisoner's spirit into dust. The Tower was not simply a prison, it was a crucible of despair, where body and soul were dismantled together. To the outside world, the Tower was a symbol of royal authority, a fortress of strength. But within its walls, the true power of the crown revealed itself through these silent torments. The rack and scavengers. Daughter. Might have been the infamous devices, but chains, manacles, and darkness were the daily instruments of control, the slow, grinding punishments that broke not only rebels and heretics, but ordinary men and women who fell afoul of politics or faith. Perhaps this is the most terrifying truth. Cruelty does not always need spectacle. It can thrive in silence, in shadows, in the simple weight of iron pressing on flesh and soul. The prisoners of the Tower did not all scream under the rack. Many simply hung in the darkness, chains cutting into their wrists, their minds unraveling with each moment of solitude. Even today, visitors walking the Tower's narrow corridors sometimes claim to feel a heaviness, a chill in the air as though unseen eyes are watching. Guides speak of ghostly figures in the Bloody Tower, whispers in the dungeons, footsteps that echo when no one is there. Perhaps it is only legend. Or perhaps it is the lingering memory of those countless souls who endured silent tortures, their agony imprinted forever in the stone. The Tower of London's history is not just one of battles and crowns. It is a history written in chains, carved into the walls by broken hands, and carried in the silence of the dead. The manacles may now hang cold and unused, but their legacy remains a chilling reminder that the most enduring tortures are not always tea. Inside the torture chambers of the Tower of London today, the Tower of London stands as one of Britain's most visited landmarks. Children laugh as they chase the ravens across its lawns. Tourists marvel at the glitter of the crown jewels. And yeoman warders in their bright uniforms tell tales that blend legend with fact. To many, the Tower is a relic of royal ceremony and medieval grandeur. Yet beneath this surface lies a darker legacy etched not in gold, but in agony. The torture chambers of the tower remind us that power has always carried with it the temptation to control through fear. Devices like the rack, the Scavenger's daughter, and the iron manacles were not merely instruments of justice. They were instruments of domination. They were designed to bend the will of the accused, to silence dissent, and to manufacture obedience. Whether the confessions wrung from broken bodies were true or false mattered little. What mattered was submission, and the demonstration that no one noble or commoner, man or woman, stood above the authority of the crown. The rack stretched bodies until bones snapped. Scavenger's daughter crushed the frame inward until blood poured from every orifice. Chains and manacles left prisoners suspended, crippled, and silenced in suffocating darkness. Each device told its own story of cruelty, but together they revealed a philosophy of power that thrived on fear. The Tower of London was not only a fortress, it was a theater of terror. Every scream, every broken limb, every forced confession became part of the performance. Yet within this darkness, there is also testimony of human resilience. Figures like an Askew, who endured the rack and still held to her faith, or Thomas Maya, who carved his truth into the walls after being crushed by the Scavenger's daughter, remind us that even in the face of unimaginable torment, the human spirit sometimes refused to yield. Their stories, preserved in words and memory, challenge us to see not only the cruelty of the tower, but also the courage of those who suffered within it. What makes the tower's history most unsettling is not simply the violence it contained, but its familiarity. Torture in the tower was not random. Sadism, it was calculated, systematic, and sanctioned by law. It reminds us that cruelty often wears the mask of legitimacy. It is justified by authority, wrapped in the language of justice, and carried out in the name of order. This is why the tower's legacy continues to haunt us. It is not just a relic of a barbaric past, but a mirror reflecting the dangers that linger in every age. To walk through the tower today is to step across layers of memory. The Bloody Tower, the Salt Tower, the dark dungeons all are haunted not only by ghost stories, but by the echoes of real human suffering. The walls are silent, but silence itself is eloquent. It whispers of screams long vanished, of chains long rusted, of bodies broken and lives extinguished. Perhaps that is why the tower continues to draw us in. Beneath the fascination with jewels and royalty lies something deeper, a recognition that history is not only built by triumphs, but by terrors. The Tower of London is not merely a tourist attraction. It is a reminder, a warning that power without mercy becomes tyranny, that justice without compassion becomes cruelty. The torture chambers may stand empty now. The rack no longer stretches bones. Scavenger's daughter no longer crushes bodies. The manacles hang unused in the dim chambers of the White Tower, but their shadows remain. They remind us that fear was once a tool of governance, and that silence was once bought with agony. As we leave the tower, stepping back into the modern world, we carry with us the weight of its history. We may admire the glitter of crowns and jewels, but somewhere behind that glitter, we know the truth, that beneath every throne there are chains. Beneath every empire, there are screams. And beneath every symbol of power, there is always the temptation to rule, not with justice, but with fear. In the end, the Tower of London is not only a monument of stone, it is a monument of memory. A place where the voices of the past linger, warning us that cruelty thrives wherever power goes unchecked. And as long as those walls stand, they will remind us. The crown may shine with gold, but its foundation is built upon blood.